Welcome back, you filthy exiles, and my apologies, I was working yesterday, so I had the video scripted, but wasn't able to do it yet. But anyway, I wanted to talk about some of the Breach, let's call it 2.0 changes in Path of Exile 1, and why they're so significant, not just for Path of Exile 1, but also what's coming for Path of Exile 2. And there's a pretty big trend here, which we can see that links the two games together, and we'll talk about that at the very end of the video. But I thought we'd go through some of the lore around Breach. Now, a bit of it's slim, but a lot of it's actually in the flavor text of the items. And I've got a theory about how this new, let's call it, expansion works in Path of Exile 1, and what it means, and what we may actually see come from it. And it may explain some of the things in Path of Exile 2 as well, around one of the key bosses. Anyway, let's get into the video and let's talk about it.
The worst has come to pass. The Hiveborn have invaded our world. We must drive them back before it is too late.
Okay, so basically just talking on lore side, while the lore in and around Breach in Path of Exile as a universe is quite thin currently, this is probably going to be planning to sort of pan that out and flesh it out more. There's enough to make some assumptions here. So what we do know is that monsters inside Breach are called, or often called, It That monsters. One example is It That Fled. Are basically tied to the Breach realm, and their names and dialogues suggest entities of Breach, often warped and alien-like, dreamlike. That's the basic themology of the name. Now, interestingly, It That is a real link here to start with, and let's go to the wiki page and talk about this one, because yeah, there's a little bit of stuff here that we should be aware of in the character dialogue, as well as some of the other things that exist around that from some of the previous monster names in the game as well. Okay, so if we go to the It That wiki, right, this is one of the Immortal Syndicate members. Now, what we can pretty much assume here is that some of his character dialogue alludes that he's Breach, from Breach, and also the drops that he gets is very Breach-centric as well, so some of the crafting drops and things like that. So we pretty much make the assumption that It That is actually a Breach monster. Also, the lore here around Breach is that monsters have references of It That in their naming sort of themology. Now, some really interesting things that pop out is the former naming conventions that exist around some of the monsters in Breach. Be it that It That reaches, It That waits, It That watches, It That whispers, and It of Tool. Now, the interesting one here is it may be an opportunity for them to revamp the meaning of some of these names. And like when I think about like It That reaches refers to potentially the hand that we see that grabs Xesht at the end of the fight in Path of Exile 2. And that could explain that there's something bigger and badder out there beyond Xesht that actually is the result of Xesht coming into fruition. Now, these are some of the character lines from It That Fled, and there's some really interesting things that pop out when we look at this. So, the hive buzzes with voices, but it is all alone. Let it go. It wants to bring a friend from the many. This is the first reference of the hive. There's also this one here, the red pyre. It will show It That prays, right? Also, lies, nature yearns for It That fled with grasping fingers. Again, alluding to potentially the hand and Xesht and everything else. So there's a lot of things coming from It That Fled's voice dialogue, and I'll put a link in the description to where I got these from, that basically alludes to a lot of lore that stems from things that It That Fled has said. But there's even more when you dig into some of the flavor text on unique items, so let's talk about that now. Okay, so the next thing that we need to talk about is obviously the purple flame that exists, which is a reference to Chayula, right? So my understanding of Chayula is Chayula sort of splintered from the other Breachlords, and now is And I have two theories about Chayula and the Keepers of the Flame, and I'll talk about that in the next part. But it could be one of two things. Either Chayula is fighting against the Hiveborn, and the Hiveborn are a outer force that exists potentially from something bigger and badder, or Chayula created the Hiveborn and is actually responsible for the amalgamation of the other Breachlords, which create Xesht. And we'll talk about Xesht in a moment because there's a little bit of lore there. But what's really interesting when you look at like Chayula, so Chayula, a bit more lore about that, is essentially who dreamt, right? So you think of like Morpheus from the Dreaming sort of themology sort of stuff. If you're a DC fan, it's very similar to that. And basically the flavor text on the unique items is really interesting. So we start to talk about like, this is severed in sleep. So his lucky thralls dream eternal, but we must crawl on our own, right? Again, there's just like a lot of really nuanced text here. Then we look at, we happily give our limbs a net woven to keep safe the bones of the lords, right? This could be alluding to the amalgamation of the other lords, right, of Breach, and basically, a net to basically capture them all together, and that could be really looking into this deep, or could have a little bit of meaning here. The Red Dream, we flow like blood in the Chayula's open mouth, and spill into the land we have watched forever. Could be alluding to the fact that Chayula actually created the Hiveborn. And again, this starts to come further and further apart as we go through this. We climb like vines up Chayula's arms, reaching into the world that should be ours. Talking about an invasion, talking about something that is stemming from Chayula and potentially them besieging the rest of the Breach realms, and then that flowing into Rayclast. The Blue Dream. We crash against Chayula's body and fall like rain into the place we cannot go. Again, an invasion, talking about basically going somewhere you shouldn't be going, and this is essentially what the Hiveborn is now doing. United in dream, they grow fat and ripe in slumber, to be fed upon when he awakes. And it could be the case where Chayula was in some sort of deep eternal slumber, and now he's woken up, and basically the Hiveborn have come with Chayula, and there is a almighty mass invasion of everything around it. But these things are all alluding very interestingly to what could be much more into the lore. The next one, the lords are chosen so carefully, only they may grace his flesh. Again, another potential reference here which could allude to the amalgamation of the Breachlords into becoming Xesht. I'll just move my head there. The Red Dream. We coagulate, a crimson shell that suffocates the unworthy. Again, the Hiveborn and the themology of the trailer talks of a chrysalis, potentially an amalgamation. Again, coagulation is a reference. The Blue Nightmare. We swell and flood and drown the undeserving beneath our might. A hive, obviously going to be like a zergling entity, potentially like a Tyranid entity, and this sort of talks to that type of themology. The Green Nightmare, we take root in the dirt and strangle those who tread upon it. Again, same sort of reference. Presence of Chayula, the dreamer stirs, the world trembles. So when Chayula awakes, then catastrophe comes, with him. And Unitol's vow, the time is nigh, war has come, we dream as one. Which could stem to a potentially Chayula invading everyone, going after a mass invasion and attacking every Breachlord, every realm, looking to take over and become the Almighty. Or there could be something bigger at afoot here. Who knows? The flavor text is very interesting because it sort of gives us a bit of an idea. Now, there are other items here, like 7 League step cards. In fleeing a reality, you step into the realm of madness. Doesn't really mean much. Something in the dark. And here we go, something very interesting. Even in darkness, you may find a friend. Happens to be an ant, right? Which could be a reference to the Hiveborn. The Undisputed. To create something truly spectacular, you must risk total failure. which again could be talking about an invasion. Chayula's taken a risk. He's amalgamated the other lords, created Xesht, and then, has taken upon an immortal fight against Rayclast and the realm beyond to take it over finally. But that's at great risk to himself, his realm, and his followers. Anyone's guess could be the lore right now in this, but there is definitely a lot of stuff in here that sort of gives a bit of an idea about what may or may not be happening. But it's fun to sort of surmise, what could be happening in the scenario. But let's talk about Xesht a little bit here. Okay, so Xesht, interestingly, is the amalgamation of Xoph, Esh, and Tul. Now, at no point is there any reference to where Unitol went, which is the 5th or the 4th Breachlord. And obviously, Chayula is the Breachlord that was never combined with Xesht. That's the fundamental lore of what we know about Xesht. Now, what's really interesting is the voice lines that comes from Xesht. Now, and obviously Xesht is a Path of Exile 2 boss. And so basically, there's a lot of things here, but the fury of the hive, the creeping dark of unburdened thought, witness a broken sun. So again, they talk about the hive, right? Again, a reference to the Hiveborn. Again, the hive shall split forth like mother's blood, right? Again, another reference to the Hiveborn. This is when he does the crushing fist attack. We watch, we wait, we dream. Forged by thought, destiny unwinds. It's very, very important to understand that dream is a very clear reference to the dreamer, right? Which is Chayula. So what I theorize here is more so around Chayula is actually the one behind why Xesht even exists. And you look at like the themology of Xesht, the purple flame, everything, right? Sort of indicates that Chayula is behind something here, has tried to amass strength and power, has created something to combine the other Breachlords or take over the other Breachlords, or potentially the other Breachlords willingly gave themselves to amalgamate to fight Chayula to defend themselves as well, is another theory that I have. The other big thing here is obviously the Hiveborn. We look at like the chrysalis process, the amalgamation. It sort of indicates that potentially that's the process that Xesht became from the 3 Breachlords that built into Xesht. So it's fun to sort of speculate that, potentially there's 2 things that have happened. So potentially Xesht has come about because Chayula has taken over and has created the Hiveborn, and in that process has subjugated his other lords and has essentially combined them to take the fight to Rayclast and the realm beyond. The other thing that may have happened is the other Breachlords rallied against Chayula, tried to fight him, lost, and then were combined to be controlled by Chayula ever so into the foreseeable future, and were put in a trance or something like that. And so now there's a lot of references to the dreaming and thought and anticipation and all these things that potentially, could be the reason as to why Xesht is the way that Xesht is. There's a lot of really cool stuff here. Now, we go into like the itemization was pretty interesting. One that sticks out is controlled metamorphosis. Our world was dying, but we chose to survive. We broke free from the chains within. So I read this, and the way that I look at this is talking about the story of what happened to the other breach realms, right? The breach realms of Xoph, the breach realms of Esh and Tul. And potentially the controlled metamorphosis diamond or item refers to them being forced to amalgamate by another entity. Potentially, I believe this might be Chayula that potentially did this in a bid to essentially create the ultimate boss to, take on us as the protagonists or take on Rayclast and the world beyond. It's really cool to think about some of this stuff because there's just like a lot of stuff they can work with from a lore standpoint. but this is what it sounds like, or it sort of alludes to when I read through this yesterday. Okay, so tying all of this discussion around, I have a few theories about what may be coming. So, the way all of this reads is that potentially the Breach Realms were invaded by the Hiveborn. I consider this like a flood-like entity for anyone who's followed Halo. It could allude to two things around this, right? Number one, there is a bigger bad guy out there that has invaded the Breach Realms, right? And potentially this could be Chayula defending their realm, which could also allude to why the Keepers of the Flame exist. It could be an order that's set up, or a cultist order that's been set up by, you know, the believers of Chayula to essentially like defend the realms of Chayula. And in that, I think you'll have to side with Chayula in order to defend against the Hiveborn. But I think further to this, potentially then Chayula then takes control of the Hiveborn, or the Hiveborn, sorry, and then basically goes against you as a former, what soon in the future becomes a former believer of the Keepers of the Flame, and essentially then turns on you and everybody else because they amass and accumulate power. Could also be that Chayula is just straight off the bat the main antagonist and is running like a counterplay and has created a worship following, which is then giving them power as the dreamer. You know, similar to like, you know, we talk about Nordic gods. They require, you know, god, you know, worshippers, or sorry, Greek gods require worshippers to be able to amass power. And so Chayula, with an order that prays to it, that it's created within a deception, has essentially amassed a great amount of power because of the power of belief across realms, if it works the same way as like god themology. These are some just like theories that I have, right? I think that this is the story of the origin of Xesht and how they became to be in existence, sort of hints at a metamorphosis in the trailer. And this could allude to how the combination of the three Breachlords occur. And we may actually see the creation of Xesht. We may actually get Xesht in Path of Exile 1 at this stage. And that's our new big bad Breachlord, right? Because you think about it, the Breachlords are quite behind in as far as content wise. So this would be a really, really good way to get everything up to speed. Now, as far as the timeline of when this has all happened, obviously this has probably taken place while we were building King's March. So as the main protagonist, we were distracted. We didn't see it. Nobody saw it. And this has crept up in the background, and now the realms have been amalgamated and warped and whatnot, and now it's spilled into our realm, and now we must basically defend our realm and send them, the Hellspawn, back into the breaches. I really like the idea of that. I think it's just really, really cool. Now, my theories here are around Xoph, Tull, and Esh, is that they were either captured or they were forced by Chayula to amalgamate, or they were deceived by Chayula to amalgamate into Xesht, of which then Chayula took control. What's really interesting here around the story of Xesht is we don't know anything about what happened to the fourth Breachlord, or the fifth Breachlord, which is Unitol. So yeah, we just don't know anything about that. So there's definitely something going on there potentially that could be a future storyline for Breach, which would be really cool. And then, yeah, finally, there's a bit of an allude to the Keepers of the Flame actually on one of the div cards that are in the game. So if we go back to the realm of Chayula, we did a lot of wiki research to understand the lore around this one yesterday. So Keepers of Corruption, okay? Now, interestingly, Flame Keepers, right? We've got a lord there that looks somewhat, it could be Chayula, and this looks like a keeper of the flame. Now it says with great power comes even greater power, right? So basically the keepers of the flame may be getting offered power in return for their service or servitude. And this is, I thought, was just a really, really interesting sort of theme here. Obviously, you know, there's the Archmage's right hand. When grasped in his hand, even an ordinary piece of wood can make the heavens tremble with fear. Again, really interesting. And the realm, if you wish to rush into strange places, be prepared to face strange things. I just thought was a really interesting one. But Keeper's Corruption is a very interesting div card. And yeah, this could again allude to what the Keepers of the Flame are. Essentially offered power for their subordinates, and that then corrupts them and takes them over time, or potentially they figure out what's going on and move forwards with that. What's really interesting is even the clothing on the character and whatnot, so could potentially allude to some, Hiveborn sort of, Eldritch sort of entity sort of thing there. But I just thought this was really interesting when I stumbled across it yesterday. Okay, so I've got a few theories around what content may be coming with this. Firstly, just on the content that this may introduce, we'll probably see some sort of Breach Unveil mod. Sort of seems to be the trend with Path of Exile 2 with the Abyss system. And this could work in a way of which we look to borrow power from Chayula, which we just spoke about with the div card, right, to fight the Hiveborn back. It could also be like a mechanism where we actually like put our weapon into a chrysalis and have to generate power and then turn that weapon into something crazier, or item, sorry. The new Hiveborn boss encounter could be Xesht. I think it will be Xesht. It just looks like it. The hand is in the game. It's sort of alluding to things to do with Xesht potentially, with all the lore and everything. It just, to me, it screams like they're going to add Xesht in the Path of Exile 1 and make it like a pinnacle boss for Breach, right? And then turn it into an uber pinnacle version. I also think that it's going to be a full revamp of Breach, right? The drops, everything. A lot of the Breach content has been quite outdated. It was one of the very earliest leagues in the game. It was actually one of the first things that I ever created a video on the channel. And this is going back like, geez, like 6 or 7 years ago now. So maybe even longer. So basically, I think like they're going to fully revamp how the system works, simplify some things down, make Breach Splinters more valuable. For a long time, there's not been a lot of value in the items coming out, except for a few, and they were very niche and hard to get. Chayula is always expensive because certain items and drops you get from it are worth it. But definitely, they're probably going to make it a lot more lucrative and a lot better to farm, because it's been a bit of a benign mechanic for some time. But it was one of the most popular leagues that was ever released in Path of Exile. So fingers crossed they do a good job with reinvigorating it. Now, what do I think all of this builds up to, right? And like, let's look past just the Breach here, right? What is this? What is GGG actually doing here? And I think this is very interesting. So they're combining the games not through the specific game that they originally intended, right, with the Amalgama 2 games. They're actually combining Path of Exile 1 and 2 through the lore. Now, some will say, oh, they were already combined, Jorgen. Yes, they were, but not the way that they're doing it right now. So there was the lore that existed in Path of Exile 1, like what we see in a lot of things that has bled into Path of Exile 2, right? But it has sort of gone one step further, which I've not ever seen a game dev company do in this respect. So essentially, they are springboarding the content between the two games over two timelines. And think of like Last Epoch, with this. So basically, you play over multiple timelines within the game, right? And things are happening synonymously over two timelines. And again, this sort of is alluded to in Act 3 in Path of Exile 2, right? So when you look at like the Val Temple, there's two timelines happening at play. I think they sat there going, what's a good way to get players to want to play both games so they can see what's happening? So obviously, Path of Exile 1 was it 30 years in the past versus Path of Exile 2, right? So there's lore links between the two games. The same characters can exist, like Rog and Tujin and all those sorts of characters. And what's really interesting is now they've added Xesht in. We didn't really have any reference to Xesht in Path of Exile 1. Now, instead of adding in the backstory in Path of Exile 2, they're going to add the backstory in the Path of Exile 1 and link the lore. And the reason why I think this is pretty significant is it means that they can come up with one league in Path of Exile 2. It can be new content. And then that will then feed the content that they then produce for Path of Exile 1, which will still be different, but it'll be like a precursor to everything that comes out in Path of Exile 2. It'll explain the backstory in Path of Exile 2, which means that they don't have to put so much unnecessary bloat in the Path of Exile 2, and they can have fun with how the story develops across 2 games and link the 2 games. So then you play Path of Exile 2, and you're like, I want to know about how the hand exists in Xesht. Where'd the hand come from, right? I assume it's it that reaches, and they're renaming the character model to be exactly that. And so, now I'm going to play Path of Exile 1 to get the lore around how Xesht came to be, because you're invested in Path of Exile 2, and then you're going to be invested in Path of Exile 1. I think this is absolutely genius, because it means it creates longevity between both games, and it means that you basically have any one idea that you come up with any one game, within a 2-league span on each game, you can basically dev from one league on the other game in the next 2-month cycle to 4-month cycle, and go and make similar content for the first game, but have it feed into the same themology, but be slightly different, and, you know, however that fits into the game mechanics. I think that this lore splitting and amalgam of the 2 games is fantastic, because what it actually strives to do is brings the community into one, and makes the games more linked than just through the game mechanics, but through the lore, the storytelling, and everything else. And I don't think many companies have done this, because usually, like, you go from the first game through to the second game, right? And you just forget the first game. But in this case, you've got 2 games running simultaneously, telling the same story, but from 2 different edicts of time. And I think or eras of time, sorry. And I think that is pretty damn smart on GGG's part, and I 100% give them credit for this, and I hope this is the theme that they're following, because it started to appear in places, and I think this was the intention. Now they've got the production cycle running on it. I think this is their direction moving forwards, and you know what? I think it's fantastic, and it means that you're going to go back from each game, and POE2 players are going to play POE1, POE1 players are going to play POE2, so on and so on. And mechanically, the games are feeling really good. So I think this is fantastic, and that's why I'm so excited. I wanted to do a bit of a longer video, a deep dive into the lore, deep dive into the conversation around it, but also just an overall deep dive into what I think GGG is actually doing. But yeah. Anyway, if you like this type of video, don't forget to like and sub to the channel. Obviously, we got a heist update just before, so I'm going to do a video on that now as well. And we've also got a couple of other videos coming this weekend. The last episode for the community builds is coming out this weekend. And obviously, we're working on the new curation for League starters for Path of Exile 1, and we start League start testing for Path of Exile 1 as well on stream this evening, or this evening and tomorrow. Anyway, I'll see you guys then in the next video and on streams, and have a good one.